Hi, welcome to my presentation on nutrient cycles. So we briefly talked about what nutrient cycles are already, but to reiterate, a nutrient cycle is the cycle that a nutrient takes as it moves through an ecosystem. That includes the different places that it moves to in the ecosystem, also the different organisms that it moves through, and the different chemical forms that it takes as it moves from place to place. Every nutrient cycle has reservoirs within it, which are places where a nutrient accumulates or is stored in an ecosystem. That could be like the ground, or the atmosphere, or the ocean, or even plant matter. And in all of the nutrient cycles that are important to us, microbes have a major role to play because they're responsible for a lot, or at least for some, of the chemical transformations that major nutrients undergo as they're cycling through the ecosystem. So it's very important for us to understand nutrient cycles, especially for agriculture, and knowing how to manage land so that it remains productive. Also, it's important for conservation and for ecology. So we'll start with the carbon cycle, which is one of the most important nutrient cycles. So this diagram is showing kind of a summary, a basic summary of the carbon cycle. On the side here you have major reservoirs for carbon. So that would be the rocks and sediments, the oceans, underground methane, which would be methane hydrates. That's just methane with a lot of water. Fossil fuels, also underground. The terrestrial biosphere would be all of the living things on the land, and the aquatic biosphere is all the living things in the water, but particularly the ocean. So you can see that most of the carbon here is in the rocks and sediments, but actually carbon that's down there in the rocks and sediments doesn't move very much, or it moves very, very, very slowly. So this reservoir is not a major contributor to the carbon cycle. The other reservoirs are more important because carbon moves in and out of them more readily. So going over this diagram here, carbon moves through the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is taken up by plants on the land, and they do photosynthesis with it, so they're incorporating it into organic molecules like sugars, but basically all of the organic macromolecules of the cell. Then animals will eat those plants and obtain the organic carbon from them. You also have, of course, some microbes that are autotrophs that live on the land, so those also take up carbon from the atmosphere. And you have microbes that are heterotrophs that live on land, so they would also be taking up their carbon in organic form from some type of autotroph, either a plant or a phototrophic microbe. Then, of course, these animals and heterotrophic microbes are using primarily respiration to get their ATP. So that produces carbon dioxide, and that goes back to the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is taken up by land plants for photosynthesis and breathed out by animals in respiration. Then you've got a dotted line here going from plants back to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because actually land plants do respiration as well. So they take up carbon dioxide and use it for photosynthesis and to create organic molecules, but then for some of that, or for some of those organic molecules that they've created, they just turn around and use them as fuel for respiration, converting the carbon back to carbon dioxide. A major input of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere these days is human activities, and in particular the burning of fossil fuels. So we pump fossil fuels up from the ground, which is of course ancient organic matter that's been compacted by all the rock on top of it, and we burn that for energy, and that releases carbon dioxide. Converting this organic carbon in the fossil fuels back to carbon dioxide. Then you have a lot of carbon dioxide that gets taken up by the ocean, actually. A lot of it will dissolve in the ocean or in other bodies of water because carbon dioxide is very water soluble. But also, of course, you have a lot of microbial phototrophs in the ocean that would be taking up carbon dioxide from the ocean or from the water and using it for photosynthesis and to fix carbon and create organic macromolecules. And then, of course, all the animals and microbial heterotrophs in the ocean would be feeding off of that organic carbon that's produced by the phototrophs. And then when they do respiration, they release or they convert some of that organic carbon to carbon dioxide and release it. When these creatures die, both the phototrophs and the non-phototrophs, their bodies generally fall to the bottom of the ocean, and thereby they carry carbon down to the bottom of the ocean as well, where it can be incorporated into the sediment beneath the ocean and even to the rocks of the crust. And then these kind of orange patches are just methane hydrates, so those are stores of methane in the soil or in the ground or in the sediments that have been kind of impregnated with water, which is why they call them hydrates. They're kind of trapped there by the temperature and the pressure. As long as it's kind of cold and there's a good amount of pressure, or I should say, as long as it's cold and or they're under a good amount of pressure, they will stay there. But gradually, you can have methane released from here and enter the atmosphere or be taken up by microbes as a food source. And then I guess the final piece is that when things on the land die, their carbon that's not taken up by microbes or fungi, the decomposers, their carbon is going to enter the ground as humus and eventually contribute to the formation of fossil fuels. So the major forms that carbon takes as it moves through the ecosystem are either carbon dioxide, which is inorganic, or various organic molecules, which are all based on carbon. The most important reservoir for carbon that we have is the atmosphere. You don't actually have a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but what you do have there is very, very important because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which means that it traps the light of the sun, and then energy from that sunlight does not radiate off into space. Instead, it stays here on the Earth and heats things up. So if you're looking at the percentage of different gases that you have in the atmosphere that are making the atmosphere up, carbon dioxide is considered a trace gas because there's very little of it compared to the other gases in the atmosphere. Most of the atmosphere is nitrogen, and then you have oxygen as another major component, and then argon, and then trace gases, basically. But carbon dioxide's effect on the atmosphere is very large, even though the total amount of it is not, because it is this greenhouse gas. So the major way that carbon dioxide leaves the atmosphere is by being taken up by phototrophs, which are generally autotrophs. So I guess I should say by being taken up by autotrophs. All of the land plants and algae, and then a lot of microbes. They take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it to organic molecules through photosynthesis. The primary natural way for carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere is to be released from organic molecules by respiration. So phototrophs or autotrophs will take up carbon dioxide, convert it to organic molecules, and then chemoorganotrophs or heterotrophs will use those organic molecules as an energy source, oxidizing them and I guess breaking them back down into carbon dioxide and releasing them again through the process of respiration, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic. You also have some carbon dioxide that would be taken up from the atmosphere by dissolving into the ocean, and some carbon dioxide that would be released into the atmosphere by evaporating from the ocean. But that give and take should be about constant and kind of even out. Now, I guess since the Industrial Revolution, you also have another major source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is our own activities, and in particular the burning of fossil fuels. So we take up these large stores of organic molecules buried deep in the earth and burn them to release energy. that also converts them to carbon dioxide, and then that gas enters the atmosphere. So this has been going on for a couple hundred years, or a little more than that actually. And in that time period, we have managed to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere by 40%, which is a huge impact. And the amount that we add just basically keeps going up. And there's also some other greenhouse gases that we produce or that are produced in larger quantities as a result of our activities. But primarily carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide cause climate change by heating up the earth, by trapping the energy of light in our atmosphere. It's difficult for us to predict the exact impacts that this will have on our planet because in order to do that prediction, we really have to understand how the entire planet works, how the ecosystems work all over the whole planet, how the whole biosphere works, essentially. It's a very large, very complicated system with a lot of moving parts that interact with each other. So, you know, that makes it difficult to make exact predictions. But it is very clear that this is a serious problem. We are beginning to feel the effects of it now in terms of increased frequency of extreme weather events, like, you know, hurricanes. We've had a lot more strong hurricanes lately than what used to be the case in the past. Also kind of droughts that affect farmers, which causes food supply disruptions. So these things are already beginning to happen now. They will only increase and get worse as time goes on if we do not do anything about the amount of carbon dioxide that we are releasing into the atmosphere. There's a lot of controversy about this, of course, in the political world, but in the scientific community, there is no controversy. Scientists agree and understand that climate change is real, it is really happening, it is caused by us, and it will have serious negative consequences for us. So a little bit more on that later on. First, carbon and biomass. So biomass is just the literal mass of living things in a particular environment or, you know, in the whole world potentially. When you find carbon in biomass in living things, it is in the form of organic molecules. All of the organic molecules are based on carbon, so they all have a significant amount of carbon in them. And all organic molecules have been made by autotrophs that have used carbon dioxide, just linked a bunch of carbon dioxide molecules together essentially to make different organic molecules. So the two types of autotrophs that we have are phototrophs and chemolithotrophs. There's a lot more phototrophs in the world than chemolithotrophs, so the biggest producer of organic molecules from carbon dioxide would be phototrophs, and specifically the oxygenic phototrophs, so the cyanobacteria, the land plants, and the algae. You also have contributions, of course, from the non-oxygenic phototrophs and the autotrophic chemolithotrophs. And chemolithotrophs, of course, generally live in different environments than phototrophs would. In order to get that carbon back out of biomass again, you have to do some form of metabolism with it, either respiration or fermentation or a one-carbon metabolism. So for instance, we do aerobic respiration, converting organic molecules such as glucose back into carbon dioxide. Ultimately, by these processes, you're going to take organic molecules and end either with carbon dioxide or with methane, which is technically still an organic molecule, actually. It would be one of those one-carbon organic molecules. Most living things that are using organic carbon to produce energy would be converting it ultimately to carbon dioxide or to some simpler organic compound in the case of some fermentations that could later be converted to carbon dioxide by another microbe. There's fewer microbes that will produce methane. You have, of course, the methanogens that produce methane from carbon dioxide, and there's also some fermenting bacteria or archaea that produce methane from different organic molecules. That process, either one of those processes, is not very common to find in oxic environments where you have oxygen around. In those types of environments, it's more common to find aerobic respiration. So it would be in anaerobic places or anoxic environments that you find a lot of methane produced as opposed to carbon dioxide. When methane is produced, some of it will enter the atmosphere, some of it may be trapped underground as a methane hydrate, for instance, in permafrost, and some of it will be converted to carbon dioxide if you have methanotrophs around, which would be probably the better thing to happen to it. It's fine if it gets trapped underground as well, except that eventually it's possible for it to be released. When it enters the atmosphere, that is not a positive thing because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's actually much more potent than carbon dioxide is, so it has a much stronger warming effect than carbon dioxide has. The only good thing about methane compared to carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas is that it is not nearly as stable in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, once it's released into the atmosphere, will be there for over a century. Methane will be there for maybe closer to around a decade or so. So the diagram is kind of summarizing these forms that carbon takes as it travels in the ecosystem, and in particular, between different organisms. So you start with carbon dioxide in the middle, the inorganic form of carbon that would be taken up largely from the atmosphere by autotrophs. Then you have kind of two sides of this diagram. On the top you have the oxic side, or the aerobic side, and on the bottom you have the anoxic side, or the anaerobic side. So the bottom represents processes that would occur if you have no oxygen present, and the top represents processes that would occur if you do have oxygen present. So if you do have oxygen present, then carbon dioxide will be removed by oxygenic phototrophs and by a few chemolithotrophs, but mostly by the oxygenic phototrophs. They will convert it to organic molecules, and then heterotrophs in aerobic environments will do aerobic respiration on those organic molecules and convert the carbon back to carbon dioxide, where it would be re-released into the atmosphere. If we're talking about an anaerobic environment, that means that the carbon dioxide would not probably be being exchanged with the atmosphere because there's no air around, or at least no oxygen around. That probably means that carbon dioxide is being taken up from the ground, where you have quite a lot of it stored in the rocks. So carbon dioxide will be taken up by chemolithotrophs or by anoxygenic phototrophs and converted to organic molecules. Actually, another source of that carbon dioxide would be like from water, which would mean that it had ultimately dissolved into that water from the air. That's where you would find those anoxygenic phototrophs living. Then you have anaerobic respirers and fermenters that will use those organic molecules, converting them back to carbon dioxide. On the other hand, you could have some of that carbon dioxide be diverted into methane by the methanogens and by certain fermenters. So you can either have carbon dioxide being directly converted to methane by methanogens, or you could have organic molecules being converted to methane, or I guess I should say more complicated organic molecules being converted to methane by the methanogens or some fermenters. Then once you have methane, that could be released to the atmosphere, but if organisms are going to keep interacting with it, then you would have methanotrophs convert it back to carbon dioxide. So that's a basic summary of the carbon cycle. Now we'll go through the nitrogen cycle. So first we'll go over the processes that are catalyzed by microbes that are important in the nitrogen cycle. As you can see, there's kind of a lot. Most of them we've gone over already. So first you have nitrogen fixation, which is converting molecular nitrogen or into ammonia or NH3. Then you have nitrification, converting ammonia to nitrite, or NO2 minus, and then converting nitrite to nitrate, NO3 minus. So in general, that's a two-step process that would involve two different microbial species. First, an ammonia oxidizer, and then a nitrite oxidizer. Then you have denitrification, converting nitrate to nitric oxide, NO, nitrous oxide, N2O, or molecular nitrogen again, all of those being gases. Then you have anammox, which is converting ammonia to molecular nitrogen, so kind of the opposite of nitrogen fixation. Then you have nitrogen assimilation, which we've kind of briefly mentioned. That is taking up nitrogen to incorporate it into organic molecules. So either taking up ammonia or taking up nitrate for most organisms, and then converting those things to organic nitrogen, mostly in the form of amine groups on amino acids or on nucleotides. Then you have ammonification, which we have not mentioned before. So that's converting organic nitrogen back to ammonia. So taking off those amine groups off of organic molecules and adding an extra hydrogen to them to create ammonia. And then finally, the last new process is dissimilative nitrate reduction to ammonia, or DNRA, which is reducing nitrite or nitrate to ammonia. So all these processes are at play in the nitrogen cycle. The diagram is kind of summarizing those and showing how the different forms of nitrogen are converted between each other by these processes. So once again, the bottom half of this diagram is showing anaerobic processes that would happen in an anoxic environment, and the top is showing aerobic processes that would happen in an oxic environment. So you start with kind of molecular nitrogen from the atmosphere. That would be taken up by microbes, specifically by nitrogen fixers, and converted to ammonia. Of course, they would need to separate that process from oxygen because oxygen inhibits nitrogenase. Then once you have ammonia, that can be converted to nitrite and then to nitrate by nitrification. The green arrow here for commonox, that is for microbes that are able to do both steps of nitrification at the same time. So usually you would have one species, an ammonia oxidizer, oxidizing ammonia to nitrite, and then another species, a nitrite oxidizer, oxidizing nitrite to nitrate, and that's nitrification. But there are a few species that can do both all in one microbial cell, converting ammonia ultimately to nitrate. Then once you have nitrate, you can convert that to these gases, nitric oxide, nitrous oxide, or molecular nitrogen in denitrification. So denitrifiers can use nitrate for that, or they could also use nitrite for that, converting both of those either to nitric oxide, nitrous oxide, or molecular nitrogen. If they're actually completing the reduction, then they would go all the way to molecular nitrogen. So that's actually the main gas that denitrifiers would produce. And that is an anaerobic process, so you're only going to really have that happening in environments without oxygen. Then you also have some nitrogen fixers that live in those anaerobic environments that would convert molecular nitrogen to ammonia. Then we also have anammox on here, converting ammonia back to molecular nitrogen. That's an anaerobic process. And then finally assimilation and DNRA. So in assimilation, you can take up, well, you'll have different species taking up either nitrate or ammonia and converting it to amine groups, which are NH2 groups. That would be either on amino acids or on nucleotides. That can happen oxically or anoxically, or aerobically or anaerobically. Then you can also have ammonification, where those amine groups are converted back to ammonia. And then finally, DNRA, or dissimilative nitrate reduction to ammonia, in which either nitrite or nitrate could be converted back to ammonia. So that's a complicated set of changes that are all occurring to nitrogen in kind of an interactive fashion during the nitrogen cycle. The major reservoir for nitrogen in the environment is the atmosphere, which is mostly composed of molecular nitrogen, or N2. The main way for that nitrogen to be removed from the atmosphere is by nitrogen fixers that convert it to ammonia. Then the main way for it to be returned to the atmosphere is by the denitrifiers that would be converting nitrite or nitrate to molecular nitrogen, or sometimes nitrous oxide and nitric oxide. So if they complete the reduction, then they'll go all the way to molecular nitrogen, and that is the main gas that they produce, but they will also inevitably produce some amount of nitrous oxide and nitric oxide, which are both bad things. Since those are both gases, they would enter the atmosphere as well. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. It's much more potent than carbon dioxide is, similar to methane, but it also lasts for quite a long time. And nitric oxide reacts with ozone in the upper atmosphere, which removes the ozone and damages the ozone layer, and it also produces acid rain, which then, of course, damages the ground. Then you also have Anammox bacteria that can convert ammonia to molecular nitrogen, which then would enter the atmosphere as well. That's maybe a less common process, but it also is a contributor. And just like the denitrification, the Anammox is only going to occur in anoxic environments where there is no oxygen available. The diagram there is kind of summarizing the nitrogen cycle. Not every process that occurs in the nitrogen cycle is represented on this diagram, but it is showing you the reservoir of nitrogen in the atmosphere, and then that is going to kind of enter the soil and be taken up by nitrogen fixers, maybe associated with plant roots, maybe just kind of free in the soil. They will convert that nitrogen to ammonia, then it goes through all these various changes, a big one being nitrification, conversion to nitrate. And then once you have nitrate or nitrite, denitrifiers will use that to produce molecular nitrogen or those other gases and return the nitrogen to the atmosphere. And Anammox is not shown on this diagram because it is occurring not to such a significant extent, I guess, but you would have ammonia being converted directly to molecular nitrogen in Ammonox or Anammox. Another important reservoir of nitrogen is in biomass, just in the animals and plants and microbes of the world. All of the nitrogen that's stored in biomass is in the form of organic molecules, usually amine groups on organic molecules, mostly amino acids and nucleotides. So mostly protein and nucleic acid would have nitrogen in it. All of that nitrogen that is found in biomass is ultimately coming from nitrogen fixers. So that could be, the nitrogen fixer kind of directly fixes the nitrogen to ammonia, and then that's taken up by some animal or plant and incorporated into organic molecules by assimilation. Or it could be that first you have the nitrogen fixer fix molecular nitrogen to ammonia, then you have nitrifiers act on it and convert it to nitrate, and then nitrate would be taken up by some plants and assimilated into organic molecules. But either way, ultimately, all of that nitrogen is coming from the nitrogen fixers. Because those nitrogen fixers are the only organisms capable of taking molecular nitrogen and putting it into a format, ammonia, which is useful to living things. Then the major way, so that's the major way that nitrogen gets into biomass, through nitrogen fixation and potentially with the intermediary of nitrification as well. The main way that it gets out of biomass is through decomposition or ammonification, in which those amine groups and the other nitrogen atoms in organic molecules are converted back to ammonia. Then that ammonia that's been released from this decomposition process has several different fates that are possible. It could just be taken up by another organism and assimilated again into another organic molecule. It could end up entering the atmosphere since ammonia is volatile. Ammonia is partially responsible for the smell of urine, for instance, and that is because it will, evaporate and enter the air as it's volatile. Finally, ammonia could undergo nitrification to be converted into nitrate, or it could undergo anammox to be converted back to molecular nitrogen. And then just a final note on ammonia that if you have the pH under 9 and there's water present, then ammonia will not exist as ammonia. It will exist as an ammonium ion. So it'll pick up a proton from the water and become NH4+, which is an ammonium ion. If the pH rises above 9, then it'll lose that proton and be ammonia again. But usually we just kind of use ammonia and ammonium as interchangeable terms, even though at neutral pH you don't have ammonia existing in water. You would have ammonium instead. Any organism that can take up ammonia would be able to take up ammonium as well. So in this diagram, you can see assimilation here. So these plants are assimilating nitrate from the soil. That nitrate is there because nitrifiers have converted it to nitrate from ammonia. And the ammonia is only there because these nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria converted molecular nitrogen from the atmosphere to ammonia. So the ultimate source of the nitrogen in these plants is from these nitrogen fixers, much like the ultimate source of all organic carbon is autotrophs. You also have some plants taking ammonia up directly after the nitrogen fixers have converted it from molecular nitrogen. Then animals will eat those plants, and that's how they assimilate nitrogen. Then as plants and animals die, their bodies will be decomposed by microbes or by fungi who would release the nitrogen in their organic molecules as ammonia. And then this process is ammonification. So we had mentioned that one way for nitrogen to enter biomass is to be converted first to nitrate from ammonia and then be assimilated probably by a plant or a microbe. So whenever you have ammonia being converted to nitrate in nitrification, that is one possible fate for that nitrate to be assimilated into an organic molecule. But it could also have other fates as well. So you could have denitrifiers convert that nitrate to, molecular nitrogen, nitric oxide, or nitrous oxide. That would be occurring usually only if you had an anoxic environment, which you might have if the soil was waterlogged. The other possible fate for that nitrate is just to be washed away, again, of course, if there's water present. Nitrate is actually very water soluble, and it doesn't really stick to soil very well, so it's easy for it to be washed away by water. For ammonia, it's more likely to stay put because it actually will stick to the soil at most pHs. So as long as the pH is below 9 and the ammonia is existing in the form of ammonium, that has a positive charge on it. A lot of soil particles have a negative charge, so the ammonia will be attracted to them and it's going to stick to them. Then when water comes and tries to wash it away, it can't wash that much of it away because it's all stuck to the soil. For nitrate, on the other hand, that has a negative charge. Most soil particles would not have a negative charge, would not have a positive charge, they would have a negative charge. So two negative charges aren't going to attract each other. That's why nitrate is more likely to get washed away than ammonia is. This is kind of the main reason why we like to fertilize with ammonia and not with nitrate. Just a simple fact that the nitrate does not stay put well. Like when you water the soil, it's going to wash out. The ammonia will remain behind and continue feeding your plants. Then another issue with fertilizer is that you probably will have some nitrifiers living in the soil that will convert that ammonia in your fertilizer to nitrate, and then the nitrate washes away or maybe is used by denitrifiers to convert it to some type of nitrogen gas. So for that reason, usually fertilizer will have nitrification inhibitors in it, just, compounds that prevent nitrifiers from completing the nitrification process so that the ammonia will remain as ammonia and not be converted to nitrate. So it's this basic process of nitrification, converting ammonia or ammonium to nitrate, that you're trying to prevent with fertilizer. You would like all of that nitrogen to remain as ammonium so it sticks to the soil and doesn't get washed out. If it converts to nitrate, it's going to get washed out. So those are kind of our most important nutrient cycles, the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. Now we'll just briefly go through some other important cycles. First, the sulfur cycle. Sulfur is a bit unusual compared to carbon and nitrogen in that there's some important transformations of sulfur between different chemical forms that actually don't need microbes to happen, so they can just happen spontaneously on their own. The biggest reservoirs for sulfur in the world are the rocks and the ocean. But sulfur that's in the rocks in the form of minerals is very, very stable, and it usually just stays there. So you have some microbes that are able to kind of mobilize the sulfur from those minerals and rocks and use it for their metabolism, but by and large, that is a stable reservoir without much traffic in and out. So the most movement of sulfur would be coming in and out of the ocean and of course the biomass, since sulfur is a part of a couple of amino acids. The major forms of sulfur that are relevant to organisms are sulfide, or hydrogen sulfide, which is H2S, sulfate, which is SO4 2-, and sulfhydryl groups, or SH groups, which would be found in a couple of amino acids in organic molecules. Sulfide isn't always just hydrogen sulfide, or H2S. If the pH is acidic, so below 7, then sulfide will exist as H2S. But if the pH is alkaline, or above 7, then you'll lose one of those hydrogens, and sulfide will exist as HS- or as S2- if you lose both hydrogens, which would just be sulfide, not hydrogen sulfide. Since those chemicals will convert between each other, readily, just depending on what the pH is, we usually refer to all three as just sulfide. So sulfide can sometimes mean hydrogen sulfide, or it could mean the HS- or S2-, depending on the pH. Those aren't the only organic compounds that contain sulfur, of course. You also have other ones. Those are just the most common ones. And the diagram is kind of showing a summary of the chemical transformations that sulfur undergoes. We'll cover that on the next slide. So sulfide can be produced from sulfate or from elemental sulfur by sulfate reduction or by sulfur reduction by different groups of bacteria, or it can be produced from sulfhydryl groups through decomposition. And the fancy name for that process would be desulfurylation. Once you've produced sulfide, the ways to remove it would be either by converting it back to sulfate by sulfur oxidation, or you can convert it to sulfide oxides or iron sulfides by reacting it with iron or with oxygen. So if sulfide reacts with iron or oxygen, those are both spontaneous processes that will occur, as long as the pH is right and iron or oxygen is present. So you don't need microbes to catalyze those processes. In either case, you would be producing some type of mineral through that. Sulfur oxidizers would, of course, be a group of bacteria that is using sulfide for their metabolism. In general, it's good if sulfide does not accumulate to really high levels in an environment, because at high concentrations it does become toxic. For sulfate, that can be produced from sulfide by sulfur oxidation, or from elemental sulfur by the same process, sulfur oxidation. So generally, you'll have the sulfate and sulfur reducers acting kind of in concert with the sulfur oxidizers, and they'll be kind of shuttling sulfide and sulfate back between them. So you'll have the sulfate reducers making sulfide from sulfate. Then the sulfur oxidizers will use that sulfide to make sulfate. Then the sulfate reducers will use that sulfate to make sulfide, so on and so forth, kind of back and forth like that. Right, so the main way to get rid of sulfate would be to convert it to sulfide and sulfate reduction, but you could also assimilate it and incorporate it into sulfhydryl groups in amino acids or other organic molecules. So those are kind of the main forms of sulfur that are relevant to organisms, but you also have some other less common forms that are relevant for some organisms. For instance, DMS, or dimethyl sulfide, that's an organic form of sulfur because it is a carbon-based molecule. So you have some algae in the ocean that are able to produce DMS. It's actually a waste product for them, but then it can be used as a source of energy by other microbes that would oxidize it as an electron donor, which produces dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO. And then DMSO can be used as an electron acceptor by other organisms, which would produce DMS again. This is showing as DMSO and DMS. So here's DMS. It has two methyl groups on it. That's why it's called dimethyl sulfide. And then when you add oxygen to it, then it's dimethyl sulfoxide. And then this diagram is just summarizing the changes that sulfur goes through during the sulfur cycle. So we're not going to go over every process on this diagram, but just some of the main ones. So here you have sulfate reduction, reducing sulfate to sulfide. Then the opposite of that would be sulfate oxidation, or sulfur oxidation, converting sulfide back to sulfate. That's this yellow arrow here. That can either be done or aerobically or anaerobically. So again, we have aerobic process on the top here and anaerobic processes on the bottom. Then down here you have elemental sulfur that could also be converted to sulfide by sulfur reduction. So you can produce sulfide either by sulfate reduction from sulfate or by sulfur reduction from elemental sulfur. Then once you have that sulfide, you can convert it back to sulfate through sulfur oxidation, either aerobically or anaerobically, and then that sulfate would be converted again back to sulfide by sulfate reduction. Then you also have sulfate assimilation on here, either aerobic or anaerobic, in which sulfate can be taken up by organisms and used to produce the sulfhydryl groups for their amino acids. And then once those organisms die and are decomposing, you have desulfurylation that can convert those SH groups back to sulfide. Next we have the cycles for iron and manganese. These are both metals that are used as cofactors by a number of different enzymes, so organisms don't need a lot of these metals, but they do need some. And we're talking about them together because they behave really similarly to each other, just have very similar nutrient cycles. For both metals, they can undergo certain transformations without microbes catalyzing them, so just spontaneously. So they're similar to similar to sulfur in that way. For iron, the two major forms that you find on this planet's surface are ferrous iron, which is Fe2+, and ferric iron, which is Fe3+. For manganese, the two most common forms are Mn2+ and Mn4+. For both of them, there's a lot of different forms they can take, a lot of different ions they can make, and a lot of different minerals they can participate in. But those two for each are the most common on the surface of the planet and kind of the most relevant to organisms. The ferric iron, or Fe3+, and Mn4+ are the oxidized forms of those elements. They're not soluble, so you don't find them dissolved in water. Instead, you would find them having fallen down to the sediments at the bottom of a body of water. And down there in the sediments, they can be used as electron acceptors by various anaerobes, which would reduce them either to ferrous iron for iron or to Mn2+ for manganese. So then those reduced forms, the Fe2+ and the Mn2+, are actually soluble, so they're then going to dissolve in the water and end up diffusing up from the bottom, so rising up in the water column towards the surface of the body of water. Once they get to the oxic zone, or the zone where you have oxygen penetrating into the water, then you're going to have spontaneous reactions between the metals and the oxygen to produce different oxides, either iron oxides or manganese oxides, as well as just the oxidized forms of the iron and manganese, which would be the Fe3+ and the Mn4+, which again are insoluble. So those oxides and the oxidized forms will, or the oxidized ions, will drop down to the bottom of the water body again. The conversion of iron and manganese to iron or manganese oxides does depend on the pH, so it doesn't necessarily occur in every single body of water. The pH has to be right. And then for iron, but not for manganese, it can be used as an electron donor. So the reduced Fe2+ can be used for chemolithotrophic respiration as an energy source, which then oxidizes it to ferric iron, or Fe3+. So one way or another, all of these reduced forms are converted back to oxidized forms, in the presence of oxygen or by certain chemolithotrophs in the water. Then those insoluble forms will sink back down to the body of water, where they can be used as electron acceptors again by the anaerobes at the bottom, converting them back into the reduced form, and then they would cycle back up. So this diagram is just summarizing the chemical transformations that iron can undergo during the iron cycle. It would be similar transformations for manganese. And the ones that are biologically relevant are pretty simple. If you're starting with the oxidized ferric iron, that can be reduced by bacteria to Fe2+ iron, which would be soluble. Then that can be oxidized back to ferric iron, either by microbes or just by the presence of oxygen. And then this diagram is kind of illustrating that process where you have these, well, I guess we would start over here with the oxidized forms, the ferric iron and Mn4+, which are insoluble at the bottom of the water, so in the sediments. Then you have anaerobes down there that will use them as electron acceptors, producing the reduced forms, Mn2+ and ferrous iron, which are soluble, so they rise in the water column. When they encounter oxygen, if the pH is right, they will spontaneously react to form the oxidized forms and to form these oxides, manganese oxides and iron oxides. All of that will sink. In the case of iron, it can also be oxidized by certain chemolithotrophs. In any case, all these oxidized forms will sink back down to the bottom of the water body, or to the sediments, where they would be used as electron donors again. Then we have the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is important because it's a component of nucleotides. They all have a phosphate group on them, and it's a component of phospholipids, which are the lipids that membranes are built out of for bacteria or for eukaryotes. Then there's also actually a lot of enzymes that need phosphorus to work correctly. So different organisms have a lot of different reasons to need some phosphorus. Usually when organisms are using phosphorus, they're using it in the form of phosphate, which is HPO4 2-. You also have just a lot of the phosphorus on the surface existing in the form of phosphate. So there's a number of different phosphates that can form that would have different, different numbers of hydrogens, different charges on them, but it's always essentially a phosphate in the center surrounded by 4 atoms of oxygen. In the ocean, you also have other forms of phosphorus that are important, which are kind of just emerging as being important. So you have certain microbes that can convert the phosphate to different organic molecules that have phosphate, like phosphonates or phosphate esters. And then you have other microbes that can use those as phosphorus sources instead of using phosphate. So it's kind of a contribution to it allows microbes to still take in phosphorus even if they're living in a place that doesn't have a lot of phosphate dissolved in the water. If you have these other microbes present that have converted phosphate to phosphonates or other organic forms of the element. The major reservoirs for phosphate are, of course, the rocks and the minerals in the ground. It's pretty water soluble, so you also have a good bit dissolved in water. And finally, in biomass, just the actual mass of organisms. Most of the phosphate or phosphorus in biomass would be in nucleotides or in membrane phospholipids. And then you just also have a number of enzymes that would have a phosphate group or 2 for their function. So the diagram is just kind of summarizing the phosphate cycle or the phosphorus cycle. It's a pretty zoomed out view. If you're kind of starting with phosphorus in the rocks as part of minerals, that can end up being broken off by water and dissolved in the soil. Then you can have like microbes or plants taking it up and incorporating it as biomass. From there it enters, just the biomass. Of course, all heterotrophs would end up eating, either plants or microbes or something that ate them and getting the phosphate from them. You would also have some phosphate that ends up in the water coming from the soil. If you have volcanoes going off, that can also release phosphate from the rocks deep in the ground into the air, which would then fall to the earth and maybe end up in the water or end up being taken up by a plant or a microbe. You also have, of course, all these water bodies running into the ocean, where you have a lot of a lot of phosphate dissolved in the water. When it comes to the bottom of the ocean, it can be incorporated into the sediments and then back into the rocks. And of course, you have all of your life forms in the ocean that would take up phosphate and use it as a source of phosphorus. And as we were just learning, you have some others that would actually not take it up in the form of phosphate, but in the form of phosphonate or some other molecule that's produced by these marine microbes. The last nutrient cycle we'll talk about is the calcium cycle, but specifically the calcium cycle in the oceans. So the major reservoirs for calcium on Earth are the rocks in the oceans. In the ocean, calcium is dissolved as its ionic form, calcium 2+ or Ca2+. Most microbes don't have like a huge need for calcium. There's some enzymes that would use it as a cofactor. Multi-celled life forms actually need a lot more calcium. Of course, it's in your bones. It's also an important signaling molecule in your cells, and you need it for your brain as well. But microbes, they're just simpler, so they don't need calcium nearly as much as you do, being as they don't have bones or a brain. But you also have some microbes that need it not just as a cofactor, but they need more of it because they actually have like a shell that they're building with it, or an exoskeleton. So like the tests that we had talked about previously in the semester, those are calcified shells around certain microbes, the foraminiferans and the radiolarans. So you have to have, those microbes have to have calcium to build those shells. You also have some other microbes that have exoskeletons that need calcium. Any microbe that is using calcium to incorporate it into some type of shell or exoskeleton is actually going to be using it in the form of the mineral calcium carbonate. So they're going to be removing calcium 2 plus from, dissolved in the water and combining it with bicarbonate that's also dissolved in the water to form calcium carbonate. The bicarbonate, or HCO3 minus, that's in the water would be there as a result of carbon dioxide having dissolved into the water. So when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it will form bicarbonate ultimately. It reacts with the water spontaneously and ends up forming bicarbonate. That process is a little bit acidic, so it actually releases protons as well. So anytime that you dissolve calcium into a sample of water, you're going to get the pH being reduced a bit, and you're going to get the formation of bicarbonate. So this use of calcium to build shells and exoskeletons by certain microbes, also of course by other aquatic life forms that have shells, it actually impacts the carbon cycle also because it involves bicarbonate. When you remove bicarbonate from the water and use it to build a shell as calcium carbonate, then you basically free up more room for the water to hold more dissolved carbon dioxide. So now you can have more carbon dioxide dissolving in the water from the atmosphere, which is also going to affect the pH of the water by reducing it. So, normally that doesn't have quite too much of a significant effect, but it is possible for those small changes to add up. And if the pH drops too low, then actually calcium carbonate will dissolve. It will basically turn back into calcium ions and bicarbonate ions and just dissolve into the water. So it is important for the pH of the water of the ocean specifically, or especially, not to get too low for these organisms that have shells or exoskeletons made of calcium carbonate, or they will literally just, their shells will dissolve. That includes like coral reefs. They use calcium carbonate to build the reef. So here you have a couple of examples of microbes that have exoskeletons made of calcium carbonate. Then here you have just kind of a general summary of that oceanic calcium cycle, where you start with calcium, the Ca2 plus ion dissolved in the water, also bicarbonate dissolved in the water. Those would be incorporated into a shell or exoskeleton by some type of microbe or other aquatic life form. Those exoskeletons can end up sinking to the bottom of the sea, where they might be incorporated into sediments. The calcium carbonate can end up in those sediments. But it can also end up just kind of on the surface of the sediments, in which case, if the pH drops, it will dissolve back into free calcium ions and bicarbonate. So, the last thing we'll talk about in this chapter are some of the ways that humans impact important nutrient cycles, especially the carbon cycle, but not just the carbon cycle. We'll start with mercury. This is not a nutrient, so it doesn't have a nutrient cycle. It does have a biogeochemical cycle, since it's an element, but if it's not a nutrient, it can't have a nutrient cycle. It is important to us, though, because it's toxic and it's useful in industry. So it's used to build electronics, it's used in pesticides, mining operations, it's actually used to burn coal, and that's not even all of the places that we use mercury in industry. Which means that we're kind of producing a lot more mercury in the environment than what you would normally have entering the ecosystems of the world. Mercury is kind of a difficult toxin because it tends to build up inside of organisms. So once you kind of consume some mercury, depending on what form it's in, it's hard to get rid of it again. It'll be specifically retained. Rather than being excreted in urine or something, the kidneys will actually reclaim it from the urine and put it back into your blood. And that happens in fish as well. So a lot of this mercury that we produce ends up in the water, and fish will end up ingesting it, and it will just accumulate in their bodies as they go on through life. When you have like little fish kind of eaten by bigger fish, now these bigger fish are eating, fish that already have more mercury in them. So bigger fish will end up with actually even more mercury than what small fish has. Kind of the higher you are in the food chain as a fish, the more mercury you probably have in you, since it accumulates. So actually, like pure elemental mercury isn't toxic at all. It's only certain forms of mercury that are toxic. One of those forms is the mercury ion, Hg2+. So a lot of the mercury that's released from industry as a pollutant is in the form of Hg2+, then that enters the water. You also have mercury that ends up being released into the air as a gas, either by industry or by volcanic eruptions. That would not be the ion form, that's just the elemental mercury form, so it's not actually toxic. But in the air, it can react with light, and light will kind of strip electrons off of it, which gives you the Hg2+ ion, which is toxic, and then that ion can dissolve in the water. Once the Hg2+ is in the water, you have certain microbes there, especially the sulfate and iron reducers, that are able to use that mercury for their metabolism, and they'll actually convert it to either methylmercury or dimethylmercury. Both of those are extremely toxic, like more toxic than just Hg2+. And another thing that's bad about them is that they can absorb directly through your skin, so they're lipid soluble. And these are the forms that are the most likely to accumulate in fish or in other organisms that eat them, but of course, since all of this is mostly ending up in the water, mostly fish would be eating them, would be eating the methylmercury and dimethylmercury. So that accumulates in the fish. The bigger the fish is, the higher it is in the food chain, the more of these toxic forms of mercury it probably has. If you're a little fish, you're just getting whatever mercury comes in from the water. If you're a bigger fish, you're getting whatever comes in from the water, and you're also getting whatever had already accumulated in the smaller fish that you're eating for your diet. So that's why big fish have more. Then we get it when we eat those fish. So all fish from the ocean have, methylmercury and dimethylmercury in them, and it does accumulate in your body as well. In general, it's usually not enough to actually be toxic for you, but it also depends on how many fish, how many fish you eat and which fish they were exactly. The smaller the fish is in general, the less mercury it probably has. Actually, what really matters there is its position in the food chain, not its size. So if you have a big fish that is not high in the food chain, you wouldn't expect that to have necessarily extra mercury. This is maybe relevant for people who eat a whole lot of fish, and especially a lot of big fish like tuna that are high in the food chain. And especially for people who really have a fish-based diet, theoretically at some point that might become not okay because of all this toxic methylmercury and dimethylmercury that's accumulating in our fish. And it can be especially kind of dangerous for pregnant women, so it's something to think about if you're pregnant, kind of limiting your intake of fish, and specifically tuna and those fish that are high up in the food chain. Luckily, what we've discovered is some mercury-resistant bacteria that are actually able to take in the methylmercury and dimethylmercury that are super toxic, and they can take in the mercury ion, the Hg2+. They can actually convert those things just back to elemental mercury, which is non-toxic. So as there is some potential that we might be able to exploit those microbes to kind of clean up our mercury mess in the future. But actually doing something like that requires having a really strong understanding of the microbes that you're trying to use, and the other microbes that live, where you would be introducing them, in the ocean, and just how they're going to interact with the existing ecosystem. So the diagram is showing kind of a basic summary of that. You have mercury. being released from industrial operations, either as, well, in the water that runs off from them, then that runs ultimately into the ocean as Hg2+, or you can have mercury released into the air by industry or by volcanoes as elemental mercury, just Hg. In the air, it can be ionized by light to Hg2+, and then that can dissolve in the water, so it all ends up back in the water. Then you have bacteria in the water, certain bacteria that are able to take in that ionic mercury and convert it to methyl mercury or dimethyl mercury. So then those things end up in the water and they accumulate in fish. And then we eat the fish. So that brings us to the biggest impact that we're having on nutrient cycles, which is our impact on the carbon cycle, which is all tied in with global warming and climate change. So we have a major or an important reservoir of carbon in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a trace gas in the atmosphere. There is not a lot of it there, but it does have a big impact on the atmosphere because it traps heat. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than there has been for the past 800,000 years. And it's 40% more now than it was about 200 years ago at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we have been the contributors to, much of a huge percentage of the carbon dioxide that exists in the atmosphere today. And it's a similar story for methane and for nitrous oxide. There's more in the atmosphere now than there has been for 800,000 years. These gases are increasing the temperature of our planet on average because they are greenhouse gases. So when light shines onto the Earth from the sun, it enters the atmosphere. Some of it is going to bounce off of the surface of the planet and radiate back into space. Some of it will be absorbed by, for instance, the water or any dark surface can absorb light, therefore absorbing the heat and energy from that light. Then if you have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, some of the light that bounces off the surface of the planet goes back up into the atmosphere, and instead of radiating into space, it's going to bounce again because it's getting trapped by these greenhouse gases. So it will remain basically on Earth and contribute to heating the Earth. So this is causing the average temperature of our planet to gradually begin to rise. And the rate of that change is constantly increasing as the rate at which we release these gases continues to increase, or at least remain steady and high. This is not a good thing. A number of people who are kind of supporting the position that global warming doesn't really matter have pointed out that the Earth has been hot before. It's been warmer than it is now. That's very true. It's also been colder than it is now. Actually, right now, we're kind of coming out of a cold period. We're technically still in an ice age right now. We're in an interglacial period of an ice age, which is a period at which you don't have huge glaciers across the Earth. But in addition to, the glacials and interglacial periods of an ice age, you also have so-called greenhouse periods where there are actually no glaciers anywhere on the Earth, and it's quite warm. And of course, these periods have happened, and life did not end, and it was okay. So it's not the temperature that's really the problem here. It's actually the speed. When the Earth's temperature changes on average as a result of a natural process, that's something that's occurring over a period of tens of thousands of years, a very long time period. It's occurring across geologic time. In geologic time, 10,000 years is actually very short. The change that we're causing now is happening over tens of years or hundreds of years. It's extremely short, extremely rapid change, and that is really where the problem lies. Organisms will adapt to changes in temperature if you give them enough time. Evolution does not happen quickly. It does not happen over a period of 10 years. It happens over a period of thousands of years or millions of years. So if we push the temperature of our planet too far, too fast, then evolution will not be able to keep up. Organisms will not adapt to the new temperatures. Many will go extinct. We will probably not go extinct. We're a little bit like cockroaches in that way. We're just hard to get rid of. But we will be impacted. The nice, cushy life that we enjoy will not be so nice or so cushy anymore. So I'll talk, a little more about that later on at the very end of the chapter. But for now, just to get into some of the nitty-gritty stuff about climate change. So one thing that matters is not just how much greenhouse gases there are in the atmosphere or how much, are being released into the atmosphere, but also, just how long do they stay in the atmosphere once they're there. For carbon dioxide, that lasts in the atmosphere on average about 120 years once it's released. For methane, that's much more potent than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't last as long, only about 10 years, not so bad. Nitrous oxide, also a lot more potent than carbon dioxide, actually lasts even longer than carbon dioxide for about 150 years on average. So some of these gases are lasting for a real long time in the atmosphere before they're eventually degraded to some less toxic chemical. Which means that when we're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere today, we can't just stop and, obviate those effects. They're going to continue affecting us. Every gas that we add to the atmosphere today will continue affecting us for the next century or more, unless it's methane, then just for the next decade. So that means that your grandchildren will still have the opportunity to be affected by the greenhouse gases that we release into our atmosphere today. So we really need to kind of plan for the future here and think about our children and our children's children and what type of world we want to leave to them. A number of the changes that we are making now will not affect us as much, especially if we're older, but for young people and for their children, they will be very serious. And on here we've got an example of a greenhouse gas, the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, that we actually did manage to get a handle on. So chlorofluorocarbons used to be commonly used in refrigeration in different industries, back in the earlier parts of the 1900s. They're now illegal, so they've been banned because they have, terrible effects on the environment, including, acting as greenhouse gases. Their production was actually banned in 1989, so we're not currently emitting any more chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, which is good. They are still there though, because of course these are some of those compounds that have a quite a long degradation period or quite a long lifetime in the atmosphere. So you still have them there. Their levels are steadily declining from year to year, little bit by little bit, but they're still going to be there for 100 more years or so. But we were able to come together on that issue, ban those chemicals. We are at least no longer making the problem actively worse when it comes to chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. And industries have found substitutes and have managed to keep trucking on without them. The graphs here are just showing the levels of these major greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over time. So in the past few decades actually. And you can see that for all of them, it's really a steady increase. Methane kind of leveled out there for a bit, and since then it's been increasing again. For methane, actually, this level off is maybe due to us leveling off our production of methane, not reducing it, mind you, but just no longer increasing it. But then, with the warmer temperatures that we have been having, with the global warming that has already occurred, there are some environments, like particularly wetlands, that are releasing methane now much more than they used to before. So that's where that new uptick in methane levels is coming from. So we'll just go through a couple of the measures that are used to quantify climate change or the impact of greenhouse gases on climate change. So first we have radiative forcing. Radiative forcing is the difference between how much light you have coming into the Earth that's actually absorbed by the Earth versus how much bounces off of the Earth and radiates back out to space. That's measured in watts per square meter. So that's affected by how reflective the surface of the Earth is. White things are reflective, dark things are absorbent for light. So if you have an ice sheet, that's going to reflect light off of it and back into space. If you have ocean water that's very dark, it's going to absorb light and not reflect it back out into space. The other thing that affects radiative forcing is how easy it is for light to get through our atmosphere once it's been reflected to actually reach space. And that's where the greenhouse gases come in, of course. So for radiative forcing in general, the bigger the number, the better. I mean, not the better, the worse. Then you have the AGGI, which is the Annual Greenhouse Gas Index. The AGGI is the ratio of the radiative forcing that's caused by greenhouse gases in any particular year compared to the radiative forcing that was present in the year 1990, which is when the Kyoto protocols were signed and the AGGI was established. So that's not, it's showing you how radiative forcing is changing through time. It's not showing you how it has changed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and climate change. It's just showing you, how much it has changed since 1990. So in 2014, the AGGI was 1.36, which means that we had 36% more radiative forcing in 2014 than what we had in 1990. In 2019, the ratio was 1.45, which means that we had 45% more radiative forcing in 2019 than we did in 1990. And of course, they haven't calculated that for 2020 yet since it's not over. So that lets you know that, it's getting worse, and it's getting worse faster and faster. There's 24 years between 1990 and 2014. During that time period, you had a 36% increase in the amount of radiative forcing caused by our greenhouse gases. Probably most of that change was, closer to the 2014 end of that time period than to the 1990 end of that time period. And then in just 5 more years, in 2014, we had 45% more radiative forcing. So if you were dividing that by year, you would find that it's, about 0.014 or 0.015 increase in radiative forcing per year from 1990 to 2014, if you assume that it was always the same each year. From 2014 to 2019, that would be a 0.03 increase, so about twice as much, which lets us know that climate change is getting much worse faster. The rate at which we are changing things is accelerating dramatically. Then this graph here, the one on the left, is showing you the relative contribution of different greenhouse gases to the radiative forcing for different years. So on the bottom you have the chlorofluorocarbons and other minor greenhouse gases, then above it nitrous oxide, above that methane, and on top carbon dioxide. So you can see that most of this radiative forcing is being caused by carbon dioxide. You have a significant contribution from methane, a smaller but growing contribution from nitrous oxide, and all of these minor gases and the chlorofluorocarbons are adding up to be a decent contribution as well. The chlorofluorocarbons are still on there. They were banned in 1989, which would have been, kind of in the earlier part of this graph, but they are still contributing to the greenhouse effect today because they have not degraded in the atmosphere yet. And you can see that the amount of radiative forcing is just going up as time passes steadily. On this graph, you can see the AGGI. and how that has changed year by year. This graph goes back much further in time, so they've kind of extrapolated backwards in time to see, if you were before the year 1990, how much radiative forcing would there have been in that year compared to 1990. So right here on the graph is where you have 1990. This is the standard everything is being compared to. So since then you can see that the AGGI in red has gone up steadily, and if you go back before then, it was decreasing all the way to nothing. The Industrial Revolution began in the late 1700s, so right around here, and that is where you see the line for the AGGI begin to rise as greenhouse gases were emitted and climate change began to occur. Then in blue, you have the contribution of CO2 only to the AGGI. In black, you have all of the greenhouse gases and their contribution to the AGGI. So you can see that CO2 is accounting for most of this, but not for all of it. In order to fully account for it, you have to include the other greenhouse gases. All of this extra carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is having a significant effect on our oceans because carbon dioxide is very water soluble, so it readily dissolves in the ocean. When you have carbon dioxide added to water, first it will react with water to form carbonic acid, which is H2CO3, and then you'll have a proton leave carbonic acid, which forms bicarbonate and a free proton. So CO2 in the oceans, you'll have some that's actually just CO2, a lot that's carbonic acid, and a lot that's bicarbonate. All of that is ultimately coming from carbon dioxide. Overall, the oceans have taken up about 38% of all of the CO2 that we have emitted into the atmosphere. And they're also trapping heat, so the oceans are hanging on to about 80% of the extra heat that we have on Earth as a result of our greenhouse gases. That's because water is such a great insulator and there's just so much of it in the oceans. So it's very difficult to actually increase the temperature of water. Surprisingly, you have to add a surprising amount of energy to do it, which is why actually water is used to insulate nuclear reactors. It's not the cheapest insulator, it's the best. So when you have all this extra light energy that ends up trapped in our atmosphere by greenhouse gases, a lot of that will be absorbed by the ocean. The ocean absorbs light well because it has a dark color. So that energy will dissipate into the ocean. It'll be used to speed up the movement of water molecules, which increases their heat. But it's actually very difficult to increase the speed of water molecules. It takes quite a lot of energy. So the temperature of the ocean has not gone up as much as you might expect given the amount of energy that it has absorbed. So I guess we're kind of lucky that we have those oceans there. Otherwise, the world would be a lot hotter right now. But it's also not good for the oceans to be warming. They're warming slowly, more slowly than the air is, but they are still warming. And as they get warmer, they become more stratified, which means that you end up having temperature differences between the bottom of the ocean and the top of the ocean that cause layers to form in the water based on temperature. So you'll have, since hot air rises, well, hot water rises, so that'll be at the top, and it won't fall down to the bottom and mix with the lower water beneath it, which is also colder water. So that's stratification. That's common to occur in lakes. It does not normally occur in the ocean, at least not to any significant degree. But it is beginning to occur more now because our oceans are warmer. When you have stratification, that's a problem for things that live in the ocean because it prevents nutrients from moving from the bottom of the ocean to the top. Normally, if the water is all kind of the same temperature, then the water will all kind of be mixing together, and you'll have a good nutrient transfer, not only from the top to the bottom, but also from the bottom to the top. Everything will be cycling. When you have stratification, that doesn't happen as much, and so you don't have that recycling or replenishment of certain nutrients on the surface. When that happens, you don't have as many nutrients that are available on the surface for phototrophs to eat, microbial phototrophs, which means they do not do as much photosynthesis, which means they do not produce as much organic carbon, which means there's not as many nutrients available for everyone else who lives in the ocean. Also, the stratification helps increase the oxygen minimum zones. So oxygen minimum zones, or OMZs, are growing in the ocean, getting larger and larger. In part, that's because of the stratification of the oceans as they become warmer. In part, that's because as water heats, it will actually not hold as much oxygen, and oxygen does not dissolve well in water to begin with, particularly. So as the temperature increases, the capacity of the oceans to hold oxygen diminishes, which is of course bad for things that use oxygen for aerobic respiration in the ocean. And the reduced solubility along with the increased stratification can lead to, or is leading to the increase in size of these oxygen minimum zones. Then you have a little zone in there where there's no oxygen. Fish don't really go there. But what does go there is anaerobes, including the denitrifiers. So it makes a really nice environment for denitrifiers to live, and then they produce greenhouse gases. Another effect that carbon dioxide is having on the oceans is reducing their pH. So you put carbon dioxide in water, it reacts with the water, it forms carbonic acid, then that dissociates and loses a proton, so you end up with a free proton and with bicarbonate ion. Since now you have an extra free proton in the water, it has reduced its pH. So that's why we say that CO2 is a weak acid. The oceans are holding so much carbon dioxide now that it has actually affected their pH. Their pH has dropped. Not by a lot, but small changes in pH actually can have a large effect because it's a logarithmic scale. So if you had a change of 1 unit on the pH scale, that would actually be a tenfold change. This is a particular problem for any organisms that form shells or exoskeletons that have calcium carbonate in them. As we had mentioned earlier, calcium carbonate will dissolve at lower pHs. So when you have a lower pH, it's harder for you to form that shell in the first place, and if the pH continues to drop, then your shell will dissolve right off of your body. So we're not quite at that point yet, but we are at the point where it's more difficult for these shell-forming organisms to actually build their shells. This is having a serious impact on coral reefs, since those are all basically built out of calcium carbonate. As the pH of the oceans continues to drop, we're going to see more and more death in coral reefs until one day they don't exist anymore at all. And they have already sustained significant damage. That's not just bad for the reef, for the microbes in the reef. It's bad for all the fish that live there. It, provides a very nice habitat for fish. Is one of the more, biodiverse parts of the ocean that sustains a very large amount of life compared to the rest of the ocean, and we are losing them. So take your vacations to the reefs soon. On the side here, I've got pictures of a coral reef. This is part of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, actually, over time. So in 2007, you can see the corals looking quite nice. In 2009, it's maybe a bit degraded, looks a little worn down. In 2010, where is it at? So this part of the Great Barrier Reef has basically been decimated. There's a lot of pictures similar to this that you can find online. I picked this one because it's actually the same part of the reef that they went back to over these different years to photograph. Another consequence of having the calcium carbonate dissolving in the ocean is that you're going to end up with more bicarbonate in there as well, which means that the oceans will not be able to absorb as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That means that carbon dioxide is actually going to be staying in the atmosphere and contributing to global warming there. So at that point, once the oceans become kind of saturated with carbon dioxide or have a reduced ability to absorb or dissolve carbon dioxide, you're going to see not only does the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, but the speed of global warming goes up as well. since the oceans will no longer be holding a good bit of our extra heat and extra greenhouse gases. They will still be holding a good bit extra, they just won't be accepting more. And another issue with warmer oceans is that when oceans get warmer, sea ice melts. At the poles, you have large accumulations of sea ice, which is very reflective since it's white, and that contributes to maintaining the temperature of the planet. When that ice melts and is replaced by open water is very dark and it absorbs light very well. So when you have an area that used to be reflective and you replace it with an area that is absorbent for light, that increases radiative forcing. And note that that's a positive feedback loop, which means the warmer the oceans get, the more ice melts. The more ice melts, the warmer the oceans will get, until eventually there's no ice left at all. So normally when we talk about climate change, we talk about carbon dioxide. Methane, of course, is another important greenhouse gas, and there are large stores of methane in the environment underground that could be some form of catastrophic if they were released into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. We also produce methane through industry, of course. At least we have leveled off the production of methane, so it's not actively increasing. Of course, it remains at a unpleasantly high level, but at least it's not going up since about the year 2000. But even though we're not producing extra methane through industry, when we look at the amount of methane in the atmosphere, it's continuing to rise and rise, and to rise more each year, so that we know its release is still increasing. And we've discovered that most of that extra methane release is now actually coming from wetlands in the tropics. In wetlands, you always have some areas that are anoxic, where anaerobes will live. Some of those anaerobes are methanogens that are, producing methane. And as things get warmer, all chemical reactions will speed up. All microbes will reproduce faster, divide faster, conduct their metabolisms faster. So as these wetlands get warmer, just the rate at which the methanogens that they house produce methane is increasing. Not only that, but we have large deposits of methane in permafrost. Permafrost is parts of the soil in the Arctic or near the poles that have a lot of organic matter in them, and they are frozen all the time. So even when the snow melts on top of the ground, underneath there in the permafrost, it's still frozen constantly. Of course, now that things are getting warmer, permafrost is beginning to melt. And when it melts, all of the organic material that it contains will be released. There's a lot of methane in permafrost, and a lot of carbon as well as plenty of methanogens that can convert the organic molecules in there into methane. So it's expected that if this permafrost does melt, there's going to be a very significant increase in global warming as a result of the extra methane and carbon dioxide being released from these stores where currently it is trapped. That's also a positive feedback loop, of course. As things get warmer, you have permafrost melting. More melted permafrost means more greenhouse gases. That means things are warmer again. That means more permafrost will melt, and so the cycle repeats until eventually all of the permafrost is gone, which would not be good. In the pictures here, on top you have, these are actually methane bubbles in a lake in the Arctic. They're frozen, so you have methane that's actually stored or trapped underground at the bottom of this lake, and sometimes, or just kind of gradually, it'll be released in bubbles that come up to the top of the lake, and as they rise, they freeze. Of course, if this water melts, then they will be released into the atmosphere. And here you have permafrost, so you can see that it's all shiny because this is actually ice. This is iced up soil and organic material. and it is melting. So normally you would not have like an exposed face of permafrost like this. The land has been eroding here as the permafrost melts. So there's a lot at play here. We have a lot of positive feedback loops at play in climate change, especially with regard to the ice at the poles and the permafrost. We don't understand how all of this works. The system is too large and too complicated for us to fully understand. Unfortunately, it is not too large for us to have a serious impact on. And you have a large role of microbes here as well, especially with regard to methane. The methanogens are playing a big role in creating methane. We don't really perfectly understand the ecology of methanogens or how to limit their activities at all. It would be good if we did. Maybe we could do something about this. All in all, it's difficult for us to predict exactly what's going to happen. It's difficult for us to predict every outcome that our actions will have. We're more like noticing them as they occur. But it is possible for us to predict some things, some bad things. And so far, when we make predictions about climate change, especially when we make predictions about the rate at which climate change will be occurring, it turns out that our predictions are too conservative, which means that climate change keeps happening faster than we think that it will. And that brings us to nitrogen. So we're also having impacts on the nitrogen cycle, not just on the carbon cycle, and it's still related to climate change. Our impacts on the nitrogen cycle are all based around fertilizer, which we make quite a lot of. When you're producing fertilizer, what you're doing is fixing nitrogen. You're converting molecular nitrogen from the air into ammonia for your fertilizer. So not only do we have nitrogen fixing bacteria fixing nitrogen on Earth, we also have us fixing nitrogen. We actually make about as much fixed nitrogen as all of the nitrogen fixers on Earth, and we put it on our agricultural land. And there, various things happen to it. Of course, some of it is incorporated into the plants that we grow, which is what we meant for, that's what we wanted to happen when we fertilized the land. But not all of it fertilizes the land and is incorporated into plants. Some of it is going to end up being washed away. Ammonia doesn't wash away a lot, but it does wash away some, so some of it will wash away, and we're, using such a lot of fertilizer that in the end you do have a significant amount wash away, and that enters rivers and streams. Ultimately, all those rivers and streams drain to the ocean, so all this nitrogen from our fertilizer is being carried to the ocean. When it gets to the ocean, it makes a dead zone if there's too much of it. Basically, you have an explosion of microbial life with this input of extra fixed nitrogen. It's just extra nutrients that they're able to use to divide at an extreme rate and to a very high level. Then you end up with a lot of heterotrophic microbes that are feeding off of this nitrogen and also off of the extra organic carbon that's been produced by all the extra autotrophs that are feeding off of the nitrogen. And those heterotrophs will also be feeding off of the oxygen, and they reduce the oxygen until it's gone, and then you have a dead zone where fish cannot survive and no other form of animal life can survive. And some of them are, quite large, and of course, as you might expect, growing as bad things seem to. In addition to the fertilizer that enters the ocean, you also have fertilizer that remains in the soil and is taken up by nitrifying bacteria that convert it to nitrate. That nitrate can, of course, also run off into the water and end up contributing to dead zones, or it can be taken up by denitrifiers that convert it, to molecular nitrogen or nitric oxide or nitrous oxide. They don't overall make a huge amount of nitrous oxide when they are metabolizing. They do make mostly molecular nitrogen, but nitrous oxide is very, very potent as a greenhouse gas, and then that goes into the atmosphere. Then you also have some fertilizer that actually enters the atmosphere. Maybe not the fertilizer itself, but the ammonia in the fertilizer is volatile and will enter the atmosphere, and the winds will blow it, all over everywhere, including over the oceans where it falls, into the oceans. So if you're accounting just for that, the ammonia from fertilizer that volatilizes into the air and is carried in the wind to the ocean, that amount of fixed nitrogen entering the ocean is about the same as all nitrogen fixation in the ocean. And that's not even including the nitrogen that ends up in the ocean as a result of runoff that creates dead zones. So what effect does that have on the ocean to have all that extra nitrogen dropping, falling out of the sky? We don't know, but as usual, it's probably not going to be a good thing. Yeah. So in this picture here, you can see the results of what happens when you have too much nitrogen in water. First, you have overgrowth of autotrophs. This would be algae. They're feeding off all that extra fixed nitrogen and growing to an extreme level, fixing a lot of organic carbon. Then all of that organic carbon that they're producing, as well as the extra nitrogen, is going to feed heterotrophs living in the water below them that consume oxygen, and then the level of oxygen in the water will collapse, and then fish who happen to be in that water will suffocate. And then this graphic is kind of summarizing how fertilizer is impacting the climate. So first you have production of fertilizer, which actually we didn't mention, but that produces greenhouse gases too, of course. Then you have the fertilizer actually being applied to the land. Some of that is going to be converted to nitrate and then used by denitrifiers to produce nitrous oxide. Some of those nitrates will actually run off, of course. Some of the ammonia and nitrates that are running off will enter bodies of water and ultimately be carried to the ocean, where they can contribute to dead zones that, are deadly for life. But also you have methanogens in the oceans that can use that extra methane to produce, that can use that extra nitrogen to produce methane as well, especially if you're in kind of a shore area where it's more like wetlandy. So our final summary of what this all means for us. One thing it means is that sea levels are going to go up. As ice melts, the sea levels will rise. How much will they rise? We don't know. We have estimates, but of course it all depends on our behavior in the future, and it depends on how all these complicated systems that we don't fully understand are interacting with each other. So how much faster will the sea ice melt as greenhouse gas levels continue to rise? When scientists make these predictions, they try to be realistic and they try to be conservative. Scientists will always err on the side of caution and the side of being conservative in their predictions. So they don't want to predict something that's not going to happen. They would rather not predict something that does end up happening. So my guess is that a lot of these predictions will end up being too modest, too moderate, and that things will become worse than how we expected. But a current reasonable prediction seems to be that by the year 2100, we will have a sea level rise of 3 to 5 feet if we do nothing, if we continue producing greenhouse gases at the level we produce them at currently. If we get that sea level rise of 3 to 5 feet, that's going to be very serious. You're going to have cities that are on the coast ending up underwater. Also where you have rivers emptying into the ocean and you have like a delta, those areas will end up underwater more so. You have islands, low-lying islands that will vanish. Some of them are whole nations with whole peoples on them that will not have their home anymore. It will be underwater. And then in places that don't end up underwater, a number of them will have flooding that they didn't used to have. So not only will you have people displaced by their homes being underwater now, but you'll have people displaced by floods. You'll have a lot more property damage from floods also. And of course, lives lost. So the graph here is showing different predictions for sea level changes by the year 2100. Each of these predictions is using a different scenario, a different set of assumptions about what our greenhouse gas output will be in the future. If we keep doing as we are doing now, we'll end up at the intermediate high prediction level, about 1.5 meters increase in sea level, which in feet is, around 3 to 5 feet. If we decrease our output of greenhouse gases, then we might have an intermediate or intermediate low or even low rise in sea level, which would be awesome. If we increase our level of greenhouse gas output, we might end up at a high or an extreme increase in sea level rise, which would be very bad. And it is possible that we might actually end up increasing our greenhouse gas output if we don't do anything, because you have a lot of nations that are kind of developing nations that are beginning to set up, industrial economies, kind of like what we have. If everybody starts emitting greenhouse gases the way that we do, there's going to be a real problem. On the bottom here you have Florida and how the coastline of Florida is expected to change with different increases in sea level. So a lot of Florida down here at the tip is pretty low lying. That's going to be underwater even at the low prediction of, or intermediate low of less than a foot of increase in sea level rise could put some of this underwater. If you're at the expected increase, if we change nothing, then that's going to be in this 1 to 2 meter range. So that's the orange color. So basically this whole tip of Florida is going to be gone. Some little bits of the coast will be lost. Some areas internally where they have, bodies of water, those bodies of water will expand and the land near them will be lost. So overall, Florida's not going to go underwater or nothing. There's still plenty of it that will be above water. But what you got to consider is that a lot of the population is actually going to be on the coasts, because most cities are on the coasts and most people live in cities. So all these people living in these cities are going to be a little bit screwed. You're going to have probably, refugees fleeing from these cities that are underwater or that are subject to heavy flooding now, and kind of having nowhere to go. And we weren't very happy about it when other parts of the world had refugees fleeing their countries. We will not be happy about it when it's American citizens who have become refugees. If we really do nothing and we end up with the extreme prediction of 2.5 meters in increase, that would be the yellow, and you'll lose even more land. And yeah, it's just not good, you guys. We'll have plenty of land left, but we're kind of dug in the cities. And you can imagine the type of devastation that will occur if a significant proportion of the people who live in cities become refugees, and if all the economic productivity of those cities is lost because no one can live there anymore. In addition to that, as the temperature changes, the parts of the world where different species can live is going to change. So the ranges for animals and for plants and for microbes is going to change. Animals will either end up migrating to the new range that is suitable for them, or they will end up perishing. What that means for us largely is that we're going to have some disruption to our agriculture. Crops that are currently grown in one place will not be able to grow there anymore. We'll have to grow them someplace else, which is fine as far as it goes, but the transition is going to be pretty rough because this is going to be happening over a short period of time, and nobody really wants to pack up and leave. It's also hard to predict, how are these ranges going to change? So, this plant isn't going to grow in this particular place anymore. Okay, but where will it grow? It's hard to predict that ahead of time. So there's going to be a lot of disruption to people who are making their living by farming, as the crops that they've been growing will no longer survive. And of course there'll be kind of a transition period where they survive, but just not great. and where those farmers are losing money and probably going heavily into debt. In addition, you're going to have effects on disease as microbes change their range. Also, the rate of cell division for microbes will go up universally as it becomes warmer. All of this is going to mean that we have more diseases in more places, and particularly those tropical diseases that you normally are not exposed to unless you live in the tropics. Well, you're going to be exposed to them outside of the tropics. That is to say, the tropics are going to expand. And places that used to be temperate, now they're going to be tropical and full of those tropical diseases. So I actually pushed a wrong button there, you guys, and advanced to the next slide, which didn't exist before I was done going over this slide, and I didn't want to repeat myself for all of that, so this is just that same slide, part 2. As Europeans, kind of started out living in Europe, it's kind of a cold place, relatively speaking, and they knew about all the diseases that were circulating in Europe. Then as we entered colonial times and Europeans started coming to other places and occupying them, you had these Europeans encountering new diseases that they'd never heard of before, and they established a whole new subfield of medicine called tropical medicine, in which you would have diseases that are caused by parasites and by like protists and stuff. Just a bunch of new diseases that no one had to deal with back in Europe. Those diseases are going to become much more widespread. And we will be dealing with them here. Weather will be less predictable as well. You're going to have more extreme weather events, more serious storms. So more storms overall, also more storms that are very intense storms. In addition, just less predictable rainfall, things like that. Everything should even out at some point once the climate finishes changing. But before we're at that point, we'll be in the transition period where weather is just not predictable. For farmers, it's very important to be able to predict the weather. You need to know how much rainfall you're going to have, and you need to know what time of the year it's going to fall in. If you don't know those things, and you can't count on the rainfall, it becomes very difficult to farm crops and make money that way. And when you combine that with the changing population ranges for different plants that we farm, this is going to be probably a big problem, and not only will it lead to the financial ruin of many farmers, it will likely, very possibly, lead to famines as well. We already have famines in some parts of the world, and I guess we all kind of figure it's impossible for a famine to happen here in the US, where water comes out of the sink, but it's actually not impossible. It's just unlikely. And in the future that we're creating for ourselves, it's less and less unlikely and more likely, unfortunately. So that's not a complete rundown of the effects that climate change can be expected to have on us, but it's some of the big ones. We don't know exactly what will happen, but we know bad things will happen. Just because our predictions aren't perfect doesn't mean that they're entirely worthless. We have been predicting climate change, actually. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there were scientists who said maybe carbon dioxide will enter the atmosphere at an increased rate and trap heat. Back in that day, people said, no, there's no way. They weren't saying that because they thought carbon dioxide can't trap heat. They were saying that because they thought it's impossible for us to release enough of it to actually impact the whole planet. They thought it's impossible for us to actually change the world that we live in. But it's not impossible, especially not now. Our population has grown exponentially compared to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I haven't checked it recently, actually, there's at least 7 billion of us. And some of us use quite a startling amount of energy, particularly here in the US. So it's very possible for us to have an impact on the whole planet. It's very possible. It's happening now. And the impact will become more and more serious unless we acknowledge it, acknowledge that it's serious, and decide to change it. And as I had mentioned, so far, things keep happening faster than scientists expected them to happen. climate change keeps accelerating faster than we expected it to accelerate. The sea ice keeps melting faster than we expected it to melt. So it's looking like things are not going well overall. Even though things are not going so well, it's not too late for us. It is still possible to change how we are interacting with the environment and preserving it. I think when I was in elementary school, I did like a paper on something environmental, like forest conservation or something, that we read in class, and have a little discussion. And one of the students said that he just doesn't care about the forest, which I didn't really know how to respond to back then. But today I feel like maybe I do. And it's fine if you don't care about the forest. It's fine if you don't care about the environment. But you should care about yourself, and you live here. We don't need to fix climate change to save the Earth. The Earth is a ball of rock. It is not alive, and it cannot die. We're the ones who can die, and we're the ones who can live unhappily. Life on Earth will go on. Many species will go extinct, but life as a whole will go on. There's been mass extinctions before. Never one caused by, a single species, but, whatever. And we'll go on as well, but in an altered form. We won't live the way we do now. We won't be able to. There won't be as many of us, and we won't live in such a nice advanced society as what we live in now if we don't take steps to preserve our own future for us. So it's not really about the environment, it's about people. I guess it's kind of hard for me to not be just all doom and gloom about it, but actually studies show that it's better if you're not. If you kind of give people the impression that, everything is hopeless, then, people feel demotivated and they won't do anything about it, which kind of makes sense. If you can't change it, why bother trying? But it's not hopeless, actually. This is not a done deal. We are driving it forward every year, but we can also start fixing it every year. And we have started fixing it, so that's good. So far, our efforts are just not enough. To be honest, the problem is rather severe, which means that in order to actually fix it, we need to have a major change, not just, small little changes. But it is possible to fix it. It's very possible. It's not too late for us at all. And it's not me and you that are really driving this. We're just living in our society trying to get by. And there's not going to be no more climate change because you decided to ride your bike to work or you didn't eat a cheeseburger today. Even though those actions do contribute little bit by little bit to climate change. What can change things would be if everybody rode their bike or everybody didn't eat a cheeseburger today, But actually the main contributors to climate change are not even the population as a whole. It's industries, it's companies, it's factories. These are the major producers of our climate change problem. And we can compel these entities to do better, by the rest of us, and to do better for their own children. We can compel them through political means. So I'm not telling you a specific political party that you should vote for. Whatever your political party is, I do encourage you to vote, and more so, I encourage you to contact your representatives in your party and tell them that you care about this, and you want them to care too. And I guess that's the message that I would like to leave you with.